Paper. It's the cheapest material you've ever bought and one of the most underappreciated. And today we're going to look at the surprisingly recent invention that made it possible. It all started in China back around 105 CE. That's right, nearly 2 millennia ago. Back then there were no paper or pencils, just heavy, expensive writing surfaces like bamboo, wood, and silk. So one day a court official named Cai Lun got an idea. He wanted to make a cheap writing surface out of plant fibers. After experimenting with different recipes, he settled on a mash of hemp, bamboo, and tree bark. Then he drained the mixture, dried it up, and pressed it into thin sheets, kind of like cardboard. Then he smoothed it out with a polished stone and vala paper. Now this isn't the only account of how paper was invented. Some scholars claim that Cai Lun actually invented the paper kite instead, while others say that his invention consisted of nothing more than mixing flax with sawdust and water. But regardless of how exactly he did it, what matters is that he did it first. But while paper might have been invented in 105 CE, it took another 300 years before it caught on. Still, around the year 300, papermaking arrived in Korea, where it was first used to wrap medicine before catching on as a writing surface. Around the same time, Chinese papermakers started adding a sizing agent called gelatin to improve its quality. This made it smoother, more resistant to ink, and easier to write on. Eventually, paper became popular in China around the 7th century. During this period, paper became so common that people even started making wallpaper to decorate their homes. Meanwhile, in the West, writing was still done on papyrus, clay tablets, wax tablets, and whatever else was handy. But during the 2nd century BCE, the Roman Empire conquered Egypt, gaining access to the papyrus fields there. Unfortunately, this also introduced them to something much worse, namely Egyptian paper, brought over by prisoners of war. Now, it's not clear whether or not Romans realized that this strange material came from plants and not precious metals. Either way, they loved it because it was lighter and cheaper than papyrus. Soon paper was being imported in bulk to Rome. In fact, the market was flooded with Egyptian paper, which drove down prices. Still, despite its popularity, paper never caught on in Rome. Most likely this was due to the lack of trees in Italy. Without a native source of plant fiber, paper remained a luxury good. Meanwhile, in China, paper was becoming ubiquitous. It could be found everywhere, from government offices to temples and homes. In fact, between 618 and 907, during the Tang Dynasty, paper was so popular that more than 10 million sheets were produced every year. But eventually, around the year 800, papermaking moved west. That's right, the technology had finally escaped Imperial China and was on its way to Samarkand. How exactly it got there is hotly debated. Some say the secret was brought to Persia by a Chinese prisoner of war. Others argue that a Persian monk snuck into China to steal the secret of papermaking. Yet others believe that an Indian merchant stumbled upon a stash of paper and accidentally set off a paper revolution. Regardless of who did what, where, when, the Islamic world was soon producing more paper than ever before. In fact, the industry would only get bigger after the Arab conquest of Spain in the 8th century. Since paper could now be made from the plentiful supply of linen rags throughout Europe, paper was still a luxury good, but its price dropped dramatically. For example, in Baghdad, a sheet cost about 20 cents. It's adjusted for inflation. While in Paris, the same sheet cost 40 times as much. And it wasn't long before Europeans saw how useful paper was and tried to acquire some for themselves. In fact, Europeans first encountered paper in Spain and Italy by the 12th century, likely through merchants or returning pilgrims. At first, paper was expensive, but local papermakers soon sprung up to meet demand. Meanwhile, the Islamic world was refining paper production techniques, including the use of a new type of press that used a screw to squeeze water out of the pulp, resulting in stronger paper. They also experimented with the use of different fibers, including cotton, hemp, linen, and jute. In fact, one Arabic text listed 21 ingredients that could be used to make paper. Everything from the skin of camels to old fishing nets. Plus, they even came up with a machine to mass-produce paper in 1080, more than 200 years before Europe's first paper mill. But ultimately, despite their many innovations, the Islamic world never put paper to wide use. Their preference was still papyrus, parchment, and vellum. To them, paper was simply a cheap imitation of those writing surfaces. Still, once it hit Europe, paper was soon everywhere. In fact, it played a crucial role in boosting literacy and record-keeping across the continent. For example, while illuminated manuscripts were all the rage, they were very expensive to produce. On top of that, monks spent dozens of hours copying each book by hand, meaning that they couldn't produce enough books to meet demand. But once paper arrived, books became much cheaper, leading to a boom in literacy and learning. In fact, the proliferation of cheap books is one of the key factors behind the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. By the 15th century, paper was being produced all over Europe, from Spain to Germany to Italy. And once Gutenberg invented the printing press, paper mills couldn't produce enough paper to meet demand. Remember, each page of every book required a separate sheet of paper, and suddenly there was a run on paper. In fact, by the mid-1400s, German papermakers were working 3 shifts a day to keep up with demand. But unfortunately, paper quality suffered during the Industrial Revolution. So papermakers experimented with using wood pulp instead of rags, which was not only cheaper, but also stronger. But it was also highly flammable, which caused several major paper mills to burn down. So to compensate, manufacturers added chemicals to make the paper less flammable, which also made it less durable. In fact, the paper that you and I use every day is weaker than your run-of-the-mill receipt paper. If we could make paper today as strong as they did in the 15th century, we could recycle every piece of paper ever made without it falling apart. Regardless, paper played a key role in the Industrial Revolution. The steam-powered paper machine of the 1840s drastically reduced the cost of paper, which lowered the cost of books and newspapers and magazines, helping to spread news and ideas all across the world. In fact, it's hard to imagine our world today without paper. Use it to print money, laws, textbooks, posters, toilet paper, and so much more. And even if we stop using paper for any of those things, we'll still need it for art and origami. So next time you pull out a piece of paper to take notes, do your taxes, or blow your nose, remember that it didn't exist until very recently. Human beings went thousands of years using materials like clay, wax, and papyrus, none of which are very convenient. So the next time you have a choice between paper or pencil and paper or computer, go old school and pick the paper. You can help preserve the tradition.